Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. A warm welcome to the 24th APPSMO 2023 Distinguished Dinner Lecture. We're really honored to have Mr. Ashok Mirpuri as a speaker for tonight's lecture. Let me very briefly introduce our speaker. Mr. Ashok Mirpuri joined Temasek International as a head in charge of international policy and governance in September 2023. Prior to Temasek International, Mr. Mirpuri held various senior roles with the Singapore Foreign Service for over 3 decades. He was Singapore's ambassador to the United States for more than 10 years, from 2012 to May 2023. His other previous ambassadorial roles were in Indonesia from 2006 to 2012, Malaysia 2002 to 2006, and Australia from 2000 to 2002. He graduated with honors from the National University of Singapore and received his MA at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies under a Raffles Scholarship. He attended the program for executive developments at the Institute for Management Development in Switzerland and the Advanced Management Program at Harvard Business School. Tonight, he will help us understand the geopolitical contestation and the role ahead for Asia-Pacific states. Without further ado, let me invite Mr. Mirpuri to address us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Lee, for that kind introduction. And thank you to RSIS for inviting me here to speak at the distinguished lecture. I have been a practitioner of foreign policy for almost 4 decades, and my world is shaped by the practice of diplomacy and foreign policy. As Professor Lee mentioned, I have just taken on a new role at Temasek International as Head International Policy and Governance, because even investment companies need to navigate the world of geopolitics and need to navigate the world of foreign policy. In my time, I spent quite a bit of my career with military officers like yourselves. Earlier this year, in fact, I had a week at Indo-PACOM with Commander Indo-PACOM and many of his senior commanders to talk about many of these issues. But as I've come back and I reflect on my 4-decade career in foreign policy, starting as a young diplomat, serving quite a bit of time in Southeast Asia, and then the last 11 years in Washington, D.C., I think that I start looking at the world slightly, almost with nostalgia from the time when I first started work. Because in the 1980s, the world was very different from where we are today. If we were doing this in the 1980s, we would not be overly focused on the US-China relationship. There were other geopolitical challenges. The Cold War was still on, and we had to deal with that as the focal point of everything we did. Some of you here come from Southeast Asian countries. If you remember, ASEAN only had 6 members at that time. 5 initially. Brunei joined in 1984. The same year I started my diplomatic career. And Southeast Asia was split. And then in the 1990s, we came together as a much larger grouping of ASEAN. And it was, we were sort of living in this world where the global community came together in order to deal with a very globalized world. Singapore here in 1996, we put together the World Trade Organization. We've put forward the whole ideas about globalization. Singapore started signing free trade agreements with a number of countries when I was High Commissioner to Australia. In the early 2000s, Singapore negotiated one of our first free trade agreements in the world with the Australians, very successfully. And in a way, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union left the United States in this unipolar moment. And we saw very strong US leadership. And the world got fairly comfortable with that. The US started trade arrangements. If you remember NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which President Trump then changed into the US Mexico-Canada Agreement when he was in office. That was hailed as a great achievement, not just because of the economic benefits it brought to the North American continent, but also because of the security benefits it brought to the bordering states of the United States. We've come a long way from that world today. And what I want to do is lay out some of these things that we are dealing with and then get into a discussion with you, because each one of you, as you look into that world, as military officers, as people dealing with military issues, need to understand the world also from the outside perspective. I remember when I was in Washington, D.C., Ash Carter, the late Ash Carter, who was Defense Secretary, when asked, what do you need more for the defense of the United States? He said, I don't need another aircraft carrier. I need the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I need trade arrangements. Because that was the world that we saw, even up to the early 2010s. Of course, President Trump felt that the Trans-Pacific Partnership was not suitable for American workers. He felt that NAFTA was not suitable for American workers. And we've seen a world in which this has changed. But before all these changes took place, all of our countries in the Asia-Pacific were the greatest beneficiaries of that globalizing world. The success you see in a place like Singapore emerged because of that globalized world, as people were looking for, the world became flatter, as Tom Friedman called it. Supply chains moved to new geographies. We were looking for efficiencies, and there was greater interdependence in our economies. The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, Apec, started in 1989. They'll be meeting later this year in San Francisco, in the United States. But this real world of deepening of global connections, of rapid digital adoption, of broadening urbanization and growth of markets was really quite unique, and the biggest beneficiary was the Asia-Pacific, more than other countries in the world. Now, all this has changed. There's been a cluster of disruptions, particularly here in the Asia-Pacific. The elements of stability have changed, and we are not certain what the next decade might bring. We can sit here and anticipate a crisis here and a crisis there. It's not going to be the same. We are standing on very unstable ground because there is a transformation. Domestic politics and international affairs are rubbing against each other today. You watch that in the US presidential election process as you see both of these things emerging. And they're adding new frictions and exacerbating older ones. I'm not saying that we need to go back to the old status quo. I'm not saying that that was really the better. Change is inevitable. But what we want is a transformation within a stable framework. How do you get a stable framework with all these changes taking place? The elements of stability are changing. And we have to now look at several new forces that have come into our world. And because now I straddle the world of geopolitics and investments, although I speak here today in my personal capacity, I wanted to lay out 5 big things that we're looking at beyond US-China relations. I know we'll get a lot into the conversation later on US-China relations, and I'll take that in the Q&A. But I wanted to look at the world as we are now dealing with, even as US-China competition has become inevitable and will continue for the foreseeable future. First, and I hinted at this, is trade. How do we deal with trade in today's world when Asia and the Asia Pacific is at the trade crossroads, Singapore in particular, but all the countries are at trade crossroads, but we find ourselves also in the crosshairs of trade tensions, because every day we find new issues in which trade is made harder rather than easier. Regulations are made not because they want to protect the consumer, but because issues of national security have now become front and center in the trade conversation. In my 11 years in Washington, D.C., I saw this very significant change when national security issues became the key area in which decision-making was made. China is no different. National security is a key part as well of the way they see the world, and they now want to have dual circulation and pull things back. But what about the rest of us who are not the world's largest and second largest economies? How do we deal with these new trade tensions? How do we deal with the challenges around trade? Because that's what helped Asia develop. That's what helped Asia create the elements of stability. The stability we see around ourselves, not just in Singapore, but the whole of Southeast Asia and the Asia Pacific, came because of open markets, came because of trade. And that's one big issue we need to start thinking about. The next issue, and this is obvious again to all of us, is technology. How technology has changed from the 1980s, obviously, but even in the last decade, and how it's become front and center of everything we do. First, we thought technology was going to help us in things like manufacturing, but today we see technology coming in areas like social networks, with areas around technology interfering and concerns around job loss because of AI. We're uncertain about the future of quantum computing, and technology has become an area in which we're not quite sure what the next step is going to be. Because when you look at the world of technology, the pace of change is far more rapid than the way that we can deal with it. It's far more rapid than we can deal with regulations around technology. It's far more rapid than the way people can deal with it. Just spend a week here in Singapore and you will see constant reminders to people to be aware of scams. People are losing money because of technology. The cybersecurity agency has put out apps that people can protect themselves because you just cannot keep up with that technology. But what about things like AI, which we don't even know what the elements and concerns will be? And of course, in the military, you look at that in quite a different context, but think of it for the man in the street. The third big trend we're starting to see in the Asia Pacific is the demographic change. And by the demographic change, it's really an aging population. You see it in Singapore, you see it across the region, you see it in the new challenges that people getting older without the ability necessarily to afford being older. I'm 63 years old. When I was born, life expectancy in Singapore was 63. I should be dead by now. Now I'm looking at a life expectancy of probably the high 80s, if not the 90s. How do we make this adjustment? How do we adjust jobs? How do we adjust the world in which we are dealing with? How do we create social safety nets? And this is not just an issue for Singapore, it's an issue around the region. And coming with these uncertainties around trade and technology, this area of aging is something we haven't quite, again, grappled with. The world still looks at older people as liabilities rather than assets. How do we look at this new world? The next one, and this is probably a very hard thing to deal with, is the net zero transition. Most of our countries have agreed to net zero by 2050 because of the reality of climate change. 2050 is a long time away, but it is not a long time away because that transition is going to be a very dramatic transition. Are we going to turn off all the lights and the air conditioning? How are we going to power all this if we do not have a proper energy transition in place? The energy demand is growing. It's not going down. And we must prepare for that new future. But again, governments, militaries have to start thinking about this energy transition. Are you going to fly a plane on sustainable air fuel? Are you going to run a ship on biofuel? Is that good enough for you, for what you need to do? How do countries deal with this future of climate uncertainty? And particularly because of the cost of the energy transition is going to be far more expensive than any of us anticipate. New grids have to be built. New sources. How do you get green hydrogen, gray hydrogen? Do we have to go nuclear? These, again, are big issues that we haven't quite come to grips with. The fifth thing that I think we're starting to see is essentially that with global capital flows, the cost of capital is becoming more expensive. No one is anticipating a fall in interest rates quite soon. Yet our economies all developed because we had cheap capital available. How do you develop all these things? So these 5 trends that we're seeing, trade, technology, aging, the net zero transition, global capital flows, we deal with this in that period of what I put on the title, global contestation. Are we set up for a world in which we can deal with these big issues without the constant uncertainty and unbalance, particularly in US-China relations, but also what's happening in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the uncertainty around that, the uncertainty in Europe? How do we deal with all these issues if geopolitics is not stable, if there is no strategic alignment among countries, if we see that every week brings a new challenge to these global issues? And particularly in US-China competition, again, in my time in Washington, D.C., I saw a very dramatic shift in the position on both sides, the way the US and China dealt with each other. And I cannot see a way in which the two countries can find a new equilibrium in the new future. The US political system, the Chinese political system, both are run in a ways that competition becomes inevitable. Each side looks at the other suspiciously. The US believes that China wants to be number one and change all the rules of the road. The Chinese believe the US does not want China to be number one and will change all the rules to make it hard for China to be number one. That does not provide us with an element of stability. We can talk later in the discussion about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and look at that, but in our region we are dealing with this. What are the options then for all our countries with all of these challenges we deal with under a framework of US-China competition? Where do we go back to? In a way, some of the regional organizations then become far more important. We have ASEAN, of course. And yes, ASEAN is itself going through a period of challenge. It's not necessarily a unified, coherent position and today. We are fortunate to have here Ambassador Ong Keng Yong, who used to be former ASEAN Secretary General. So he knows some of these challenges that we deal with. But I think the more we do in ASEAN, the more we do to pull ourselves together on these issues becomes far more important in this world of instability. But there are wider organizations as well. I mentioned APEC, that pulls together a number of countries. We have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that includes ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Again, another way to get things done. And through these organizations, we need to pull countries together, even as we deal with a world of US-China competition. I mentioned the APEC meeting in San Francisco in November next month. It's not just a meeting about economic cooperation. It's also a meeting where there is extreme expectation that President Biden will meet President Xi. They have not had an opportunity to meet since the Bali meeting last year for the EAS, and they will meet potentially. Neither side wants to confirm the meeting yet, but I think the rest of us would like to see a meeting, because until the leaders of these two countries sit down and bring a certain amount of calm to their relationship, that will always create uncertainty for the rest of us. They didn't have any other opportunity to meet earlier this year. Traditionally, the US president and the Chinese president meet 2 or 3 times a year at G20 meetings, at ASEAN, on sidelines of ASEAN meetings. This time they did not do that. So it becomes very high expectation of that. But we're also seeing a role not just for US-China, but also the rise of middle powers. How do you deal with these middle powers? As new organizations like the BRICS expands, the Indian G20 featured another expansion of how they look at the world. All these things have given us that elements of instability. All these things give us concern that the next decade is going to be very, very complicated for us. All these things tell us that all of us together have to work closer, more integrated, more connected, to make sure that there are no misunderstandings or miscommunications that could lead to an inevitable conflict. Now, I've left out many items on this, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have on specific areas, both in Southeast Asia and the wider region, and happy to share that with you. Thank you very much for your attention.